Everyone. It is a real pleasure for me to welcome you all here in the audience and those of you on Zoom to a discussion of Corbell's one book for this year, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. As I said in my letter to the students and to many of you verbally in this room, you know, we're not endorsing at Corbell all of the arguments that our authors are making, but we are saying that this is a timely and important question and well worth our contemplation. And that, you know, the history of the book reveals and the case it makes are really worthy of our contemplation as a community. Obviously, From Here to Equality is focused on the circumstances of Black Americans in this country, but the arguments they make are really, in some ways, universal. And of course, there's no lack of other contexts, both in this country and around the world, in which the legacies of past injustices and current injustices are pretty profound, and questions about the obligations of those who, in the majority, or those more privileged towards those who suffer from those consequences are pretty important questions. So it is wonderful, though, in particular, to welcome the authors of that book, my friends William, Sandy, Darity, and Kirsten Mullen. Full disclosure, Sandy and I were colleagues at Duke for, I don't know how long, Sandy, a very long time, 20 years or so. And our friends. Sandy is an economist of some considerable stature. He's the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy at the Terry Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke, also Professor of African and African American Studies and of Economics, and he directs the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equality, or Social Equity, I should say. His research is, I'm always amazed. He's written on so many different things. It's really voluminous, from macroeconomics to issues of finance in developing countries, to the history of the Industrial Revolution, to the transatlantic slave trade and its legacies. And most of his work is in one form or another on economic stratification, economic inequality, the labor market, etc. It's really quite an extraordinary body of work. Kirsten Mullen is a folklorist and the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and of the Carolina Writers, Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings writers of color to the Carolinas. She consults on a variety of projects, and you and I, Kirsten, never really had a chance to talk about what you do. It's really quite fascinating. But she was a consultant that helped to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. She's worked on coastal folklore in the Carolinas. She's trained students to research and document the state's African American music heritage, consultant to the North Carolina Museum of History's projects, and a writer for many museum catalogs, journals, as well as for publications like the American Prospect. Anyway, together, they have written this book. Sandy and Kirsten, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Fritz. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see you again after a few years. And as you said before we started, a lot has happened since then. We were just chatting before many of you came in. Jokingly noted that a few things have happened since we were together almost 3 years ago. Well, let's jump in. There's so much to talk about. Before that, we want to say thank you to you and to the Corbell School for adopting our book as a community read. There have been some high schools that have done this, but this is the first time a university community has done it. And so
we're very excited and pleased.
Well, that's great. And you know, we felt the committee here that was looking at the books for this year and reading quite a number of books, thought that it was such a powerful and compelling history of the United States and a compelling, certainly a compelling moral case for reparations, and a challenging book, to be sure, maybe even more challenging in the current political climate than when you started it. Maybe we can turn to that at the end. But delighted to do that, delighted you're here. So let's just start with the basics. You know, most Americans are really not aware, are fully aware of the extent of economic disparity. And you focus in the book a lot on wealth and the wealth gap. We could take other measures, obviously, and you do in the book. But why is wealth disparity so important? First of all, how big is it in this country, and why is it so important?
Well, I guess I'll start. So for us, the wealth disparity by race, the black-white wealth gap, as people customarily refer to it, is the single most effective economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white racism. So if one were to try to add up all of the atrocities that had taken place in the United States, directed against Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved here, you could, in principle, come up with a total sum of money that would constitute a bill for compensation. But we think that that's an intractable project. We've actually completed a paper recently, a draft at least, of a paper recently for the Journal of Economic Perspectives, in which we demonstrate the difficulties associated with trying to itemize the atrocities. And so what we attempted to do in From Here to Equality is to try to identify a single measure that would capture a host of the effects and consequences of this long trajectory of American racial injustice. And we settled on the racial wealth gap, in part because wealth seems to be fundamental or instrumental in determining family opportunity, individual opportunity, family security, and individual security. And this is in part because wealth, unlike income, provides people with the capacity to secure their circumstances in the event of an income loss, whether it's attributable to the loss of a job or it's attributable to be confronted with some exceptional expense like a catastrophic illness. Regardless of the circumstances that result in a shortfall of income vis-a-vis expenses, wealthier families have a much greater degree of capacity to weather the storm. They also can participate more effectively in a highly monetized electoral system in the United States. They also have the opportunity to buy their way into higher amenity neighborhoods and ensure that their children are able to emerge from college or university with a debt-free education. They're better able to purchase quality legal counsel when confronted with the criminal justice system. They're better able to engage in business ownership if they start with an endowment of wealth. And of course, they're better able to transfer resources to subsequent generations for the purposes of enhancing their capacity to have opportunity and to be financially secure. So when we look at the racial wealth gap, we're looking at it as a pronounced gap in opportunity and economic security. How big is it? Well, in the 2019 survey of consumer finances, the Federal Reserve provides us with an estimate that indicates that the gap is $840,900 per household. We estimate that that corresponds to a difference per person of approximately $350,000. Now, you know, interestingly enough, that $350,000 figure is less than the $450,000 that's being proposed as restitution for the families that in families that experienced separation between parents and children at the border of the United States during the Trump administration. So, so we actually think that in some sense, the $350,000 is a modest estimate and constitutes the minimum figure that's appropriate for a reparations plan. One other way I'll propose that we think about this is Black American descendants of US slavery are about 12% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. So our objective is to at least bring the Black share of wealth into conformity with the Black share of the population. And if that constitutes a payout of approximately $350,000 per person, 40 million eligible Black Americans out of a total of 45 million Blacks in the United States, then that would constitute approximately $14 trillion.
So thank you for that. Great summary of the magnitude of the gap. And I want to spend most of our time talking, and you make a strong case of why this matters in so many ways in terms of economic mobility and other opportunities in life. I want to spend most of our time talking about the why, and you do in the book spend most of the time about the why, the extent to which this truly is a legacy of American history and at various points in American history. And I guess, a sort of fundamental question in my mind is, and I put it this way, is how long is the shadow of the past? You talk about the history, obviously, antebellum, the choices made at the timing of the founding of the country, obviously slavery, decisions made in the aftermath of the Civil War, the Jim Crow period, and to some extent, although you don't dwell as much on it, much more contemporary circumstances. But a lot of the book is about the long history. And I guess the question that in my mind and maybe in others' minds is just how long is that shadow of the past?
Right. Well, or another way to look at it is, what caused this racial wealth gap? How did it come to be?
Indeed, yes.
And so, the racial wealth gap is a creation of the federal government. It began as the Civil War wound down. The federal government made a promise of 40-acre land grants to Black people who were newly emancipated, but it didn't follow through on this promise. There was an initial allocation made to some families, but after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson takes over, he almost immediately begins to reverse these policies. This would have been a tremendous leg up, for the freed people. We're talking about a 30-mile wide band of land stretching from the Sea Islands of South Carolina all the way to the St. Johns River in Florida. And especially if the Union Army had been left in place to protect them, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. I mean, these are people who were skilled farmers. They knew a lot about agriculture. And the federal government initially, I think you had talked to us about the Port Royal experiments. I mean, there were several situations that in which the federal government had already placed Black families on 40-acre land grants, even while the Civil War was underway. And those experiments were wildly successful. The crop yield was high. The work ethic was extraordinary. A lot of whites were saying, the Black people won't work hard unless they're enslaved and, unless there's the threat of the lash. And this was absolutely not what what unfolded during that experimental period. But as we said, Andrew Johnson takes over. He instructs the Freedmen's Bureau to give that land back to the traders, back to the secessionists, back to the Confederates who had owned it formerly. And once again, the Black people are, destitute. And in some cases, they had less than zero because they had invested, in buying seeds and, equipment. And so that investment was lost when those crops were seized
and given back to the Confederates. So at the same time, beginning in 1862, the federal government issued a policy called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act provided 160-acre land grants to white Americans, including European immigrants. So already we've got baked in a disparity. You know, Black Americans are receiving 40-acre land grants, or promised, and then denied those 40 acres. But white Americans, including recent immigrants to Europe, did get their 160-acre land grants. So these were lands that were in the western part of the United States, land that had just recently been occupied by Native American peoples. So we're talking about 270 million acres of land, a land mass that would be the equivalent of all of Texas and all of California today. So this is, the way that the federal government completed its colonial settler project, pushing the Native American people off their land, and annihilating anyone who dared to disagree with this plan. So 1.5 million white families received those land grants. And that translates to 45 million white Americans who are today still benefiting from that single federal policy. The program was in place for almost 70 years. The last land patent was settled in 1980. So folks own this land, yes, in Alaska. Folks own this land. Buffalo Bill Cody's parents had a land grant in Iowa. They paid $2 for their 40 acres. The program was in place for almost 70 years. So people own this land outright. It was tax-free, but most importantly, they could pass down the profits and the land itself to their offspring. So consequently, you have white Americans who are aided by the government, in their ability to accumulate wealth and then pass it on to their children. One of our colleagues, Jennifer Mueller, asked 150 students in one of her classes to talk to their parents and grandparents, find out, what's the source of your family's wealth. And, it was quite intriguing, what the students learned. So 1/3 of the white students in the class discovered that there was a land grant in their family. Of the remaining 50 students, 12 or 13 of them were Black, the others of color. Not a single one of the Black or students of color's families had a land grant in their family. The Black Americans who did receive land grants did so, and I'm not talking about her class now, but I'm just talking generally about the Black Americans who did receive land grants, did so primarily through the Southern Homestead Act, which was introduced later and lasted less than a decade. So the numbers there are relatively negligible. I'd like to just share just one example of what Jennifer Mueller learned from her class. So in 1880, one of the families received a land grant in the Panhandle area of Texas. For 2 generations, the family leased out the land. So when the original, so they're receiving a steady revenue stream, from this government largesse. All right, so then the original recipients of this free equity from the federal government died. Their children decided to divide the profits among themselves. Now before, so the patriarch died, and then the mother moves with the 8 children to Austin, Texas, so that they'd have a greater opportunity to go to college. 6 of the 8 get a college degree. They emerge debt-free, right? So again, assisted by the government. Then in 1980, a full 100 years after the patent was made, natural gas was discovered on the land. And it turned out to be the largest such deposit in the area. So large, they received a total of $100,000 in revenue the very first year. So basically, you're talking about the federal government, giving these white families a dividend check every month. And this is something that white Americans have had access to that Black Americans, have not. So this is why we're saying that the racial wealth gap was created by the federal government. We've seen now how during the 19th century, the way the federal government assisted white Americans in stepping into the middle class was through the acquisition of land. But in the 20th century, it was all about home ownership. So the Federal Housing Authority and the GI Bill were programs that made it possible for mostly white Americans who were coming back from the war, veterans, to readjust. And it's the first time that white Americans in large numbers were able to buy a home. Previously only elites were able to purchase a house, these programs. So now you've got federally backed mortgages, you've got insurance for these home loans, and these are available, often with 0 down payment, whereas before you needed at least half the price of the house, which was beyond the means of most people. And again, you've got Black people being excluded. One of our colleagues, Ira Katz-Nelson, has written a remarkable book called When Affirmative Action Was White. And he charted 1 year in the 1940s in Mississippi where over 3,000 white veterans receive this government support in the form of home mortgages, and only 2 Black veterans received them. So,
yes,
not even close. And then in New York, state of New York and northern New Jersey, in the same year, 60,000 white veterans received the benefit, and 167 Blacks. Dude, this is all of New York and part of northern New Jersey. So Black veterans were more likely to be allowed to use their GI Bills for education than to purchase a house or farm or business. But there's a problem there too. They only could go to colleges that would accept them. And most colleges and universities were segregated at the time. In Mississippi, where more than half the population was Black, only 15% of colleges and universities accepted Black students. So even if you got the GI Bill benefits to pay for your education, it was difficult to use them.
Right.
So the few historically Black schools didn't have the capacity to handle all of these Black vets. They couldn't just move into student housing down the street. The housing was segregated, not available to them. Plus most of those schools had been formed as vocational institutions. So they didn't really offer the kinds of programs that many vets were looking for. Most historically Black colleges and universities at the time did not have an engineering program. They didn't have the degrees in technology that the veterans had been exposed to in the military. So once again, Black Americans are left out. And if you look more recently at COVID relief, you're talking about Black businesses, that were largely excluded from these programs. So in every instance, we find when the federal government is the one that's cutting the check, they're making decisions about who's in and who's out. And at every step, the racial wealth gap is widening because white Americans are being invested in while Black Americans are being disinvested in.
Well, thank you, Kirsten, for that. I mean, it is. I mean, one of the things I certainly personally reading the book, I knew some of this, but the cumulative effect of it, the extent of it over a long period of time. Let me ask just one more question about the history of this, and then we'll sort of turn more to the present debate. But in terms of the history of it, of course, as you know, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on what was known as the Atlanta Race Riot of 1906. They were always called race riots at that time, very similar to what happened in Tulsa. We just acknowledged the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa really pogrom. This is a long, terrible history, beginning in some ways with Andrew Johnson and the backlash against Reconstruction that then morphs into what is known as the Jim Crow period and then carries well into the 20th century. But one of you perhaps could say a word about the extent of that phenomenon. That is, city after city, in those places, what you had was enormous, it was violent and many people killed, and also enormous destruction of wealth in that time period. And I wonder if you could just fill out that history a bit.
Certainly. I'm going to start. I know Sadie wants to add some things too. So we write in From Here to Equality about the political intimidation, economic exclusion, and the erasure of communities where Blacks have attained some measure of affluence. It's almost the case that any Black city you've heard of, from this time period, the reason you've heard of it is that white people destroyed it. That's why it rose. It rose to prominence, and it drew attention to. They drew attention to themselves, and white people said, "No, we can't allow this to happen," and continue. So this was the aim of a wave of massacres conducted by whites from the 1870s during the period called Reconstruction through the 1940s, and especially after, leading up to World War II and immediately thereafter. W.E.B. Du Bois had referred to Reconstruction as this all too brief period of, quote, the 7 mystic years, right? When the, quote, majority of thinking Americans in the North, at least, believed in the equal manhood of Black people. So we document one of the earliest white riots in Memphis in 1866, but also the brutal attacks conducted by the self-named White League in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, and in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Coushatta, Louisiana in 1874. But then white mobsters rioted in Danville, Virginia in 1883. Then in 1888, marauding whites in Fort Bend County, Texas, laid out what became a playbook for dissenting white men confronted with duly elected Black and white municipal, county, and statewide officials. They called it the White Declaration of Independence. And over 400 professed white Democrats signed this document, aligning themselves with those who, quote, declare that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin, end quote. So then a decade later, in 1898, whites in Wilmington, North Carolina, from every social and economic class, destroyed Black businesses and homes, burning them to the ground, and injured or murdered Black residents. Studies are underway currently to determine the connection between those white outlaws and the eventual owners of the property that Blacks lost or abandoned when they fled for their lives.
Now, you mentioned the Atlanta riot of 1906 as a topic that you've studied. There's a book by Gregory Mixon, which you're probably familiar with, that's on the Atlanta riot. And one of the things that Mixon points out is that the individuals who fomented the uprising in Atlanta were actually borrowing directly from the playbook that had been used in Wilmington, North Carolina. Yes. They were in direct communication with one another. And so it's our impression that these 100 massacres were not isolated, spontaneous events, but were events that ultimately were based upon the sharing of information by the individuals who engaged in these terrorist acts. It's very clear in the case of Wilmington, North Carolina, that extensive preparations were made before the assault took place, to such a degree that both the fusion governor of North Carolina, Daniel Russell, had been informed that this was likely to happen, as well as William McKinley, the president, being informed that this was likely to happen, and neither party intervened to prevent it. And so as I said, there was 100 of these massacres that took place between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s. In the year 1919 alone, there were approximately 35 of these events that took place all across the country, north, south, east, and west. And we have begun the process of trying to estimate what the property loss was. We can assign a value to lives lost. It seems a little perverse, but economists customarily do this. And the estimates that people are using nowadays run anywhere from $5 to $10 million per person. But it seems a bit more coherent and reasonable to think about trying to assign dollar values to property loss. And so if we just were to take Tulsa alone, the estimates that are presented in an issue of the National Geographic that came out mid-year 2021 is in the vicinity of $600 million. And the estimate, the present value estimate for the massacre, the property loss and the massacre that took place in Tiny Elaine, Arkansas today is about $10 million. So one could try to go through each of these massacres and come up with corresponding estimates. The data doesn't always facilitate that, but in these two cases, it's possible to come up with a reasonable estimate.
Yeah. So, one of the things I found most fascinating in my undergraduate thesis, I don't want to claim too much, it was actually a man named John Dittmer who rediscovered the Atlanta race riots. He was a historian at Tougaloo, I had met him, and that's how I even learned about it. But one of the most fascinating things to me about it, and this really bears on one of your central arguments, is the extent to which Atlanta at least white Atlanta, chose to forget and to write it out of its history. And you mentioned 100 massacres. I doubt more than a fraction of Americans, at least white Americans, are aware of the extent of this. And it's not just that time period, but as we move forward in time, our mutual friend Jacqueline Hall, written about the long civil rights movement, the notion prevalent in this country that, yes, we might have had a problem with Jim Crow, but we kind of fixed it in the civil rights movement. We passed civil rights bills, or similarly an argument about affirmative action, acknowledging maybe there have been some handicaps, but with affirmative action, and often a case made around welfare and the social safety net, that somehow this is sufficient. So there are two questions embedded in this, really. You know, one is about why we choose to remember and tell the story of history the way we do. And the other is about why we've resisted, or we've want to believe that the structural issues have been taken care of. And therefore, this must be about behavior. And you push back strongly, in my view, rightly, against those kinds of arguments, but they are very prevalent. And so I'm curious how you react to both of those.
Awesome. And I know Sandy has much to say about the second part of your question. So we coined this term deconfederation, right? To talk about this, what the United States did not do. We did not punish the Confederates. When you think about what happened during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, denazification did happen. Now, interestingly, as we have studied that reparations case, what we have learned is, the decision was made to appropriate the money first, to compensate the victims first, and then many years later, they worked out, what all of this meant and how laws would change, such that, you don't see these memorializations to Nazis in Germany. You don't have Nazi flags, in courthouses and on government lawn, state houses, or or military bases. This is not the case. But this did not happen in the United States. Andrew Johnson pardoned basically all of the Confederates, including the officers. I mean, it was like this big Christmas present that he gave them. So by the end of that first year that he was in office, all bets were off. They were actually even made eligible for the Homestead Acts, because initially, any traders to the Union were not eligible. Well, he waived all that. We talk about one of the groups from the South who was writing to a colleague and saying, we were waiting for the hammer to drop.
And I was so struck by that. There was an expectation that it would be almost a willingness to acquiesce to much stronger measures. Right?
I mean, that was the moment. I mean, people fully expected to have to co-govern with Black people. They fully expected to have to enter into contracts with Black people. They fully expected that Black people would own property, would sit on juries. And then they said, the president has given us more hope than we ever dared, to act. And so they began tentatively to, act illegally, to encroach on the rights of Blacks. And they looked to see what the consequences would be. And seeing none, they became bolder and bolder. And in many places, were even more punitive. Because at least during slavery, the quote unquote owners of these enslaved Black people were protecting their assets to some extent. But after slavery ended, there was no recourse for these Black freedmen. They were on their own. Even a white child could make a claim, and they'd be thrown into court and jail and worse, because that child's word would mean more than theirs. But the case that we would like to point to, from the work of historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall, whose work we greatly esteem, is her research on the middle and high wealth white women who, are largely responsible for the history that we all know. And I'm speaking here of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but also the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so these, white women pressured school districts to replace their community's history books with pro-Confederacy tones.
Sounds familiar.
Those are the, by the way, I grew up in Georgia. You can probably still hear my accent. And the 8th grade required history was Georgia history. And it was all about the War of Northern Aggression and the Lost Cause. It was straight out, it was exactly what you're describing. This is some time ago, but not ancient history.
Well, unlike you, I went to school in the Pleistocene era. And one of the high schools that I attended in Texas, in Mount Pleasant, Texas, had a Daughters of the American Revolution chapter at the school. And so yes, we absolutely had one of those textbooks. I think out of, a textbook that was maybe this thick, there may have been 4 pages about Black history. And, the Black people were always standing in a cotton field or playing the banjo. And they were very happy, or dancing, while doing all of that. So basically, we're talking about, pro-Confederacy tones that were written by authors that the UDC had sanctioned, or in some cases, the UDC themselves wrote textbooks. But they got blackballed, the authors who had been writing those texts. You find when you look at the textbooks that were written immediately after the Civil War, like the first 10, 15 years, they are very accurate to what you see in the news reports and to what you see in the letters and the journals of people North and South who were actually going through it. I think there's this abrupt shift when the UDC gets into the textbook business. But not only that, not only were they romanticizing the causes of the Confederacy in the ways that you described, they also were depicting Blacks as servile, happy-go-lucky creatures, whose highest aspiration was doing the bidding of their owners 24/7. And then also importantly, they omitted the voices of dissenting whites. So certainly the dissenting Black people's voices were omitted, but they also omitted the voices of dissenting. Abolitionists.
Now, I think we actually report in the book that at one point there was far more abolition activity in the South than there was in the North.
Which was amazing to me. There's like over 100 societies across the South for 1830. But then these groups got busy. And I'm talking about, the white leagues, and they drove these people out. And in some cases killed them.
Now, to be frank, frequently these Southern abolitionists were in favor of returning Blacks to the African continent. So they were repatriation advocates at the same time that they were abolition advocates.
Even though the majority of these Black people had never resided.
But they were opposed to slavery, and they were strongly opposed to slavery, but they didn't have the capacity to maintain a political foothold in the Southern states. And I know in your work, your work has done a tremendous benefit to folks thinking about the power of narrative. And here, this is another instance when we're looking at the effects of the construction of narratives. And there's some narratives that have emerged that are products of researchers for whom we have a great deal of sympathy, but these narratives actually somehow obscure the full story. So one example is the impression that has been circulated that the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 was the only municipal coup d'etat in the history of the United States. Yes. And this is not correct. I mean, the massacres that took place in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, in Coushatta, Louisiana in 1874, in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1874, all involved the ousting of elected officials who were representatives of the Republican Party at the time. Now, you know, of course, the Republican Party today is the party of Strom Thurmond, not the party of Abraham Lincoln. But in the 19th century,
was
the
reversed,
Republicans,
yes.
yeah, they've reversed, yeah. But what I wanted to emphasize is that the municipal coup d'etats that took place under the aegis of the white supremacy movement are blatant precedents for what took place on January 6th this year in Washington.
Yeah, let me bring you to the present. I'm going to weave in some of the questions that were submitted by students and colleagues here. One is just so coming to the present, you make a case, you make the argument that, and I think you make a very strong argument for the moral case for reparations, but the criticisms or the critiques of the argument, you cite a number of them in your book, but I'm curious which of these you think is the strongest critique of, and how do you answer that? And if you need, you know, and I can elaborate. I mean, I do think some of them are really about, let's call it the practicality of this. And so you began to address that earlier in your estimate of 350,000 relative to other things that we're doing on other scales. But you know, what let me leave it there. You know, what would you say is the strongest critique of the arguments for reparations, and how do you address that?
Well, to be frank, we don't think any of them are particularly strong.
All right. So let me. All right, I'm going to take it in another direction then. So. We've been witnessing the enormous difficulty faced by President Biden moving forward with a bill that over 10 years is much smaller than the number that you are looking at. And I'm curious, and this is another question from one of the students, was about whether in this particular moment, or as you look at the political landscape of today, why it is you are even remotely optimistic that something as encompassing as what you propose could actually happen.
Well, I think 3 years ago, we would not have been invited to have this type of conversation in the first place. And we have had the opportunity to do a number of these. I think the events of 2020 have actually launched an opportunity for Americans to explore issues and policies that we have tended to ignore or dismiss or set aside. So just the mere fact that there is a chance to have this type of conversation, to talk about reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery is something that is a credible or reasonable policy option, is a very fresh start from our perspective, and gives us some grounds for optimism. And then, you know, I think Kirsten might share some information about what we know about attitudinal change that is taking place.
That'll be very interesting, yes.
So as recently as 20 years ago, colleagues at the University of Chicago had a poll and learned that only 4% of white Americans thought that some kind of cash reparations were appropriate for Black American descendants of US slavery. Then 16 years later, the number had moved to about 16%, so almost a percentage per year. Then this year, that number is now over 30%. Now, we don't have a crystal ball, but the numbers are moving in the right direction, and we are definitely encouraged by that. And as Annie said, you know, this is a conversation that has been pretty strong and building for 3 years. There's no precedent for that in my lifetime. I mean, Stan and I both grew up in a Jim Crow world. You know, the first decade of my life, half of my mother's life was spent in Jim Crow. I mean, I do remember, you know, seeing the colored signs, the colored water fountains. I do remember when it was, you know, for the first time possible for us to have dinner at the bus station. That was the only restaurant in Fort Worth, Texas that was integrated. And we dressed in our Sunday best and went to the bus station and had a meal. So, you know, progress was very slow at that point. But a lot of things are at least on the table now. And when you talk about the value of, you know, the total cost of the bill that Biden is proposing, when you look at what we have done in this country, when you look at the amount of money that was spent bailing out the banks in the previous decade, when you look at this whole series of rescue CARES Act plans, we have the capacity to spend large amounts of money. The question is, what will it take? I mean, what are you willing to do to help make that happen? That's the question.
Indeed, like you, I went to all white schools until I was in 8th grade, and so, you know, I sat on the, you know, on the other side of that and seen a lot of change in my lifetime. Sandy, I think the last time we talked about this, you were really just starting your book. I think we were having lunch, and I think I was very, very skeptical. I don't know if you remember that, but you and I had a conversation.
But you were not alone.
So there's some small measure of progress. Let me.
But I think I'd like to reinforce the point that Kirsten was making, that yes, there are tremendous obstacles in the present moment that are being posed for the Biden proposal. But we have but prior to this, the nation has spent what, upwards of $6 trillion to try to handle the pandemic. And so we're talking about a bill of $14 trillion. We even propose in the book that it be spaced over no more than a decade, but if it's spaced over a decade, then you're talking about a considerably lower outlay per annum. And, you know, from our perspective, the only limitation on additional federal spending, because the federal government is a sovereign currency issuer, the only limitation is the risk of producing significant inflation. And so any new expenditure program would need to be designed with the inflation risk in mind. And so we talk about some other ways in which you might mitigate inflation through an expenditure program of this type and from here to equality.
I would say too, well, if I mean, just jump in real quickly too, you know, people will say, oh, you're just tilting at windmills, you know, but, you know, if you think about it, in 1850, you know, very few people were envisioning the end of slavery. And yet there were people who were steadfastly trying to figure out what that might look like. You know, in 1900, you know, no one was talking about seriously about enfranchising women, you know, giving the franchise to women. Or if you look at 1960 world politics, you know, apartheid in South Africa seemed like something that was going to happen for the rest of eternity. But you had people who were, you know, organized and trying to think about how they could make this happen. And without that work, you know, you're really not going to have any kind of change. So we've been willing, you know, to join the chorus of other people who are trying to figure out, you know, what are the building blocks that need to be put in place. But I wanted to say too, you know, reparations has already happened in the United States. This is not a new thing. It's not a new concept at all. You know, it usually takes the form of monetary payments. You know, when the United States was compelled to compensate the Japanese Americans who had been wrongfully incarcerated during World War II, they were given 120,000 victims were given $20,000 payments. So this is per person. And so if you think about a family of, say, 6, and some of these, the families tend to be a little, a little larger, and you look at that in today's dollars, you're talking about, the equivalent of about $300,000, $400,000, in some of those cases. That's not a trivial amount of money. People say, oh, $20,000, that's not much. But that's in 1988 dollars. That's when those awards were made. But then if you look more recently at the victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, 53 individuals, I'm sorry. So when you look at those numbers, they're quite significant, what the individual payouts were. And then, when you're talking about the families that had individuals who were held hostage in Iran, I think 53 individuals, the decision was made that they would receive $10,000 per day. $10,000 per day of their captivity. This just happened. So they received on average $4.4 million per individual who was taken hostage.
Yeah.
So we have precedents. We have some very generous precedents that have taken place.
We agree with that. We also have some other terrible precedents, and one of the questions that I posed in our conversation or exchange, also by students, has to do with Native Americans. We sit right now on land that was taken from the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and prior to that, Ute nations. Native Americans would seem to have a very, if not, there are differences obviously in the histories, but a very strong claim to reparations. So I'm curious, you mentioned very briefly in your book, but you don't spend much time on that. You mentioned in passing that you agree that Native Americans would have a similar claim. I'm curious whether you feel like the arguments you are making for Black Americans are to the extent to which they are really comparable for Native Americans, and what the implications of that should be.
So people often say, oh, slavery was Americans' original sin. That was the first sin. Well, no, the first sin was the taking of the land from Native Americans. We absolutely believe that Native Americans have a claim to make against the US government, but we would say that it's different from the claim for Black Americans. Our understanding is that their claim is one for sovereignty, whereas Black Americans are making a claim for full citizenship rights. So these are very different things. We absolutely support Native American reparations claims. It's simply not the claim that we're making in From Here to Equality. Now, one of the things that we have observed across the, 130 or so presentations we have given, when people bring up Native Americans and other groups who also are owed some kind of recompense from the US government, we often wonder, okay, is the idea that these individuals are going to put their heart and soul, their muscle, their dollars, their talents into all of these different potential claims that they are giving voice to? Or is this a way of deflecting the conversation altogether? This whole kind of log rolling effort, we find, tends to push all of the conversation off the table. And so we would guard against this idea that we have to, before we can get Black reparations or before we can get this other groups, we have to get all these others. I mean, it just seems like a way to just dismiss it and say, this is just too complicated, it's too hard, it's too expensive. But I think all of these groups should move forward, compare notes, support each other, but keep them separate. When we studied reparations movements around the world, specificity was really important. This is why we talk about Black American descendants of US slavery. These are individuals who can meet 2 eligibility standards. 1, a lenient standard, and 2, an identity standard. So these are individuals who can trace their lineage back to at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States, and who for at least 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations study commission or a reparations program self-identified on a legal document as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro. Right? There are many groups that could make claims. I mean, we think about Black people from other parts of the diaspora who came to the United States after the mid-1960s. Right? These are people whose ancestors were enslaved elsewhere, but not here. These are not people whose ancestors were promised those 40-acre land grants that, had they been awarded, profits from that free equity could have been utilized in real time, but also passed on to generations. We're talking about the Black people who were not allowed to accumulate wealth in this country from those 40-acre land grants over what would now be 6 or 7 generations. Yes, they have claims to make to the countries that enslaved their ancestors. So if you were from Trinidad or Antigua or Jamaica, that claim would go to the UK. If you were from Haiti, you would take that claim to France, which is a curious case because Haiti was made to pay reparations to France. So Haiti should get that money back with interest. But there are many, many, many groups that could make a claim on a wide range of European nations. But that is not the claim that we're talking about in From Here to Equality.
You know, it's also interesting that when reparations claims have been put forward for other communities, people don't generally say, well, what about Black Americans? Or what about group X, Y, and Z? It seems to be an issue that only gets raised when the case for reparation, one that's made for Black American descendants of US slavery. And then there's another sensitive issue that I think needs to be raised in this context, which also sets up a further dividing line between the Black American case for reparations and the Native American case for reparations. And that's the fact that the 5 civilized tribes, as they are sometimes called, were slaveholders, and for the most part sided with the Confederacy during the course of the Civil War. And so, you know, it's a little bit perverse to talk about unifying the claim for reparations under those kinds of conditions.
Well, we are recognize the complexity of this and appreciate that answer. We are unfortunately just about out of time. I did want to, just very quickly perhaps, you have been talking a bit, and maybe this is a question you'll also push back on, but we are a School of International Affairs. And the question of what the extent to which what we do in the United States and the arguments you make here should or can be an example for other places. Obviously in the Americas, as you've been referencing, you know, very similar histories of enslavement of Africans, but elsewhere around the world. To what extent do you feel, again, you know, I understand the focus and you make the case well as to why one should focus in this context on Black Americans, but to what extent do you think that the lessons that can be learned here or the case that you're making here really does or could extend to other cases in other countries?
Well, I think that we are relying to some degree on the experiences with reparations that have taken place in the United States as well as in other countries for trying to craft this particular case. You know, particularly significant for us is the precedent that's set by the U.S. government's payments of reparations to Japanese Americans. And it's striking that I think a significant portion of the Japanese American community endorses reparations for Black Americans because of their recognition of the parallels in terms of the need for compensation for injustice. But if the United States were to finally adopt a reparations plan for Black Americans, I think that would provide a significant signal and precedent for the claims that are being made by other Black communities across the African diaspora. You know, whether it's the Congo making a claim on Belgium, whether it's the Namibian tribal communities, the Hereros and the Namas, making a sufficient claim on Germany, or whether it's Jamaica making a claim on the UK. If the United States were to adopt a comprehensive reparations plan, I think it would be a very, very powerful precedent that would influence and support the efforts that other communities are making.
Well, that's a great note for us to end on. I'm sorry we are at time, and I want to honor your time. It opens up, I think, for all of us in this room and online, even more conversations beyond. But I can't thank you enough for writing the book and for being with us today. Thank you so much for the conversation. We really appreciate it. So please join me in thanking
Thank you. Great.
Be well. I'll come back and we'll have that beer and we'll talk about it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Right. Bye now.